officers at Memorial University and one of the co-hosts for today's event, Munalum 101 Navigating Cross-Cultural Communication. This is the second part of the three-part series, and we're delighted to welcome people back. We're also joined today by our amazing facilitator and co-host, Jennifer Kelly. So welcome again, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment for the land acknowledgement. We recognize that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups. We acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. And we encourage you to take a moment to reflect on the lands where you are joining from today and the Indigenous people for whom these lands are traditional territories. At the Office of Alumni Engagement, we're passionate about creating opportunities for our alumni to connect with Memorial, no matter where you are. Munalum 101 began during the early days of the pandemic, and it's now a cornerstone of our programming. Whether you join us online or in person, we're hoping that you're going to stay connected with us and each other through Memorial. Beyond today's sessions, we offer many ways to stay involved. We have programs, events like this, and our online offerings, and you can find the details on our website or reach out anytime. You can see that we have a Bel Air Direct slide, and we would like to give a special shout out to Bel Air Direct, formerly Johnson Insurance, who is our official partner. Bel Air Direct provides home and auto insurance at fantastic rates for Memorial alumni, and we would encourage you to either scan the QR code with your phone if you have it, and to see what rates would be available to you. So before we dive in, there are a couple of housekeeping items that I'd like to mention. Following the event, like last time, there will be a Q&A portion. You can submit your questions using the chat function, which is you will find at the bottom right hand of your screen. Feel free to post them early. Last time there was a lot of engagement, which was really great. However, it would be helpful if you're asking a question, if you could perhaps start using a couple of question marks, and that will allow our team members in the background to be able to quickly identify questions that are coming through as opposed to some of the commentary. As well, if you're interested, you can adjust the layout of your screen. You can do that. You'll see a layout button, which should be on the right-hand side of your screen, to see Jennifer's slides in a larger format. If it hasn't automatically done that for you through our system, then we would recommend that you use a stack or side-by-side view. Like last time, this event will be recorded and we'll share the link with registrants in a follow-up email. I also wanted to note that because of the high number of people that are on the call and that have registered for this event, individuals will be muted. So we do encourage you to use the chat portion if you're interested in engaging with us. Now, I would like to introduce or reintroduce for those of us that were together for the first session to our presenter and co-host, Jennifer Kelly. Jennifer has been a facilitator with Gardner Center for 7 years, teaching courses in cross-cultural communication, cultural safety, workplace communication, presentation skills, and more. Jennifer has also worked with worked as a curriculum developer with many of the Gardner Center's clients, including the government of Nunavut. Among her degrees and qualifications, she holds a BA and a BEd from Memorial. Jennifer's here to lead us through the ins and outs of inclusive communication, which I believe we all know is an essential skill in today's personal and professional environments. So, Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Allison, so much. I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment just so I can address you personally. Thank you for those who have returned from last week. For those of you who worked with Gardner Center before, welcome back as well. And we truly appreciate your continued trust. And for those of you who are joining us for the very first time, whether you're new to Gardner Center or perhaps an alumnus of Memorial University, a very special welcome to you as we spend this time learning together. And for those of you who are coming back, you're returning, you attended last week, it's so wonderful to have you back again. Before I go into the main presentation, I want to reintroduce Gardner Center. Gardner Center is a leader in professional development and executive education within Memorial's Faculty of Business Administration. We are dedicated to empowering organizations and individuals across all sectors, and we do this by providing practical and interactive courses and webinars like this one in partnership with alumni designed to equip you with the latest business strategy. Our programs always foster dynamic learning environments where we get to learn from each other and bring together diverse perspectives. So I encourage you at any point to visit us online at www.mun.ca/Gardner Center. You can even just sign up for our newsletter and hear about our upcoming courses. So without further delay, I'm going to go back to sharing my PowerPoint presentation so we can begin today's webinar, part 2 of the 3-part series in inclusive communication. So last week we discussed culture, what it is, what it represents, and we did a really amazing cultural iceberg activity where we got to reflect on the parts of culture that are not always visible to us. And we talked about ways we can work to build stronger interpersonal relationships with diverse populations and groups across all regions and cultures. Today, we are going to focus on developing that greater understanding again. So building on what we did last week, we'll continue that effort to build greater understanding and sensitivity to other cultures. And to achieve that, we're going to learn 2 theories in cross-cultural communication. And I encourage you to do some deeper research on these theories after the webinar has ended because they're really informative and they can help guide us into understanding and again, developing that sensitivity toward other cultures. We're also going to discuss just some of the key ways we can communicate better. That's what we're here for, right? To learn better and stronger inclusive communication practices. Here's our outline, so what to expect from our time together today, those 2 theories that I mentioned in cross-cultural communication, high versus low cultures, and individualism and collectivism, 2 leading theories in cross-cultural communication. And then we'll end our time together by discussing how we can communicate better. Like last week, I'd like you to take a moment to note in the chat or in a notes app in your phone, or maybe it's just a notepad and a pen, think about your learning goal. So last week, I had the pleasure of reading a lot of your learning goals. A lot of you shared them with me in the chat. I welcome you to do that again. When we think about a learning goal, you're thinking about what is it that I'm hoping to take away with from today's webinar? What is it that I hope to do with that information and knowledge on cross-cultural communication? So I invite you to take a moment to record your learning goal now, either in the chat, in a notes app on your phone, or using your notepad. Give you a moment to do that. So my learning goal, of course, is to keep bridging that knowledge gap. And as Natasha, I'm going to build on what you said so that we can then apply these strategies in our workplaces or our educational environment. So that's always my goal, to bridge any knowledge gaps that we might have and even that I might have, because I know that I can learn a lot from everyone here today. We're a learning community. That's why we're sharing our perspectives with each other. And ultimately, we want something to be able to apply in our workplace environments. So if anyone else would like to share their learning goal in the chat, you can do so now. I'm going to begin the presentation by thinking about what is cross-cultural communication. So last week we started with the definition of what culture is. Now we're going to think about what is cross-cultural communication. So by now you've probably read what's on the slide. It's essentially the exchange of information ideas and meaning between individuals or groups from different cultural backgrounds. Cross-cultural communication is also about understanding how cultural values, norms, language, and communication styles influence that communication exchange. So we might remember from last week when we did our cultural iceberg activity, for those of us who were joined us for that session, we did a really neat learning activity where we got to think about the layers of culture and how sometimes the facets of a culture like traditions, norms, behavior, language, that's not always visible to us. And sometimes we really need to make an extra effort to learn about someone's culture so that we can enhance our communication. So cross-cultural communication is all about that. It's understanding how cultural values, norms, language, and communication styles, those things that are often hidden underneath that iceberg, how they impact and influence communication. If we gain a better understanding of this, then we've already improved our cross-cultural communication. Let's take a moment to think about the influence of cross-cultural communication in the workplace. For those of you who may be joining as a student or maybe not necessarily looking at using this in the workplace, that's okay. When I list these, I'd like you to think about it in terms of the context and perspective that you're bringing to this session. So the influence of cross-cultural communication in the workplace involves a lot of elements. So it can affect pronoun usage, how we negotiate with others, how we communicate about work in terms of tasks, delegation. It can influence how we resolve conflicts. It can influence how we define work policies and procedures, making decisions at an organizational level. And then there's more simple things like how we greet each other, how we establish deadlines for projects, how we dress, our manner and approach, how we deliver presentations or even just a communication exchange, so that nonverbal communication aspect, how we evaluate other people's ideas and proposals, and how we set organizational and departmental priorities, and how we perceive hierarchy and leadership and teams. So all of this is influenced by the perspective that we are bringing to a context, whether it's work or an educational context. All of this is influenced by cross-cultural communication or the culture and region that we are from. In the chat, I'd like you to list some other ways that you think cross-cultural communication influences a workplace or educational or community setting. So I'd like to hear from you in the chat. I've listed some, and like I said, they're mainly focused on the workplace, so how those interactions take place in the workplace around project management, deadlines, work delegation, tasks. I'd like to hear from you now in the chat. How does it connect? How does cross-cultural communication influence other settings like education or community? So Natasha listed well-being. Definitely. Some other ideas. Building morale, an excellent point, Melinda. Really good point. Chantel brings open conversation to a setting. Yeah, and I would say that it impacts how that conversation is laid out and what happens in that exchange. Bringing ideas or info in about new cultures, absolutely. Mike, Jenna, the importance of holidays, what an excellent point. Those things matter. We don't all have the same celebration dates, right? And we need to be aware of that. Establishing expectations. Yes, establishing expectations around norms and behaviors in an education setting or a workplace are usually based on the primary culture that that workplace or setting is from, but there might be members that share or practice different cultural norms or beliefs or behaviors, right? So how do we bridge that? How do we make sure that each party understands where the other is coming from when it comes to setting expectations or things like norms, behaviors? Yeah. Excellent. Thank you for those who listed some examples in the chat. Individual behavior. Yes, it definitely influences individual behavior, performances at work. Exactly. Yeah, really great instincts as always from the audience. Comfortableness in social setting, an excellent point. We kind of take for granted that we're going to chat with our colleagues in the lunchroom or we're going to go to a networking session, but it's not always the same experience for everyone, right? We're bringing into these social settings our own belief systems. And we know from last week, for those of you who joined us last week, we know that culture really defines often how we behave and our norms, and that's what we bring into social settings. So it's different for each of us depending on our culture. And finally, feeling united and accepted. Yes, that's a great way to close this slide. When we think about the influence, it can really influence how well we feel accepted and how well inclusivity is promoted. Excellent insights, everyone. Let's move into some theories on cross-cultural communication. So I'm just going to cover a few points of these theories because, of course, we only have a certain amount of time together in our webinars. I do want to say that I teach a full day inclusive communications course where based on this content, but we get to really delve into more details during that full day. That is, of course, with Gardner Center. You can check that out on the Gardner Center's course calendar. But today, I want to bring to you at least the foundational aspects to get you started in maybe researching some of these theories more detailed later on so that, again, you can use them in your setting. So let's go to the first, which is high-low culture. High context culture. So what I want to say first of all is that I've listed here the regions that are mostly associated with a high context culture. And you'll see that I have them listed here. But like everything, we don't want to completely generalize. So yes, in research and in history, these regions are most closely associated with being a high context culture. But that does not mean that every single person from one of these regions follows the practices I'm about to outline. So always check our biases and be open to the fact that not every single person from these regions may practice the elements of high context cultures. But again, in research and in history, these regions are mostly linked with being high context, and this is what it means. They rely more on contextual elements. So what happens in a high context culture is that it's very group focused, group or community focused, and everyone understands their particular role in that culture or in group, and words are not as necessary. So nonverbal communication is highly supported in a high context culture because everyone in a high context culture, if they believe and practice these principles, will act a certain way according to their purpose and role within the larger group setting. The social relationship in a high context culture is really determinant by status and hierarchy. So it's very different than in a low context culture, which I'm going to show you what that means in a second. Words and sentences are often collapsed and shortened because in a high context culture, there's an automatic understanding of your role and how you communicate with others in that in group. And communication for anyone at a higher level, such as a leader, might be very different than that of a low context culture. These cultures tend to have communication that is very fast and proficient because, again, it's based on your knowledge of how you behave and act within that particular group. There's a real group focused. Communicators within the group are expected to know and understand unspoken communication. So, nonverbal things like pausing, silence, eye contact, all of that has codes that are automatically understood and embedded within that culture. So, for example, you'd be very aware of the level of eye contact you might offer to someone in a leadership role versus someone on the same team as you. It might differ. Low context is the opposite. We'll compare if there are opposite points. And again, I've listed some regions that are closely associated with this, but it doesn't mean that every single person from these regions will practice what I'm about to show you now. The verbal code in a low context culture is primarily information or the spoken word. They rely more on understanding through direct language. So remember, in high context, there's a little bit more of a focus on the nonverbal. In a low context, understanding is really based on words and direct understanding. The communicators within low context groups really feel the need to speak or to write their meaning, their expression, and the expectation is to communicate in a way that's consistent with how they feel. So, in this sense, there's a little bit more of an individual focus versus a large group focus. And it typically involves, again, transmitting very direct, explicit messages. So there's that more reliance on words and particular norms and meanings that are shared by members of this culture. That's how they would convey meaning. And sometimes we might see regions that are linked with low context cultures being a little bit more uncomfortable with silence because, again, they're more accustomed to using direct language to express what they want, to deliver instructions, and there's less focus on looking for nonverbal communication codes. So these are the differences between high and low context cultures. So, two questions: which do you identify with? And what do you think about these theories? So, which do you identify with? Let me know in the chat. Thank you, Sarah. And what are some of your thoughts and insights on this theory? And at the end of the webinar, I'm going to list the theorists so you can investigate these theories more on your own. But for now, what do you think about this? A lot of you so far are saying you're from a low context. Which do you identify with? Share in the chat. Thank you, everyone. I see a lot of people are resonating with the low context. Thank you, Sonia. High context. Okay. Interesting, Andrew. Depends on your social setting. Very good point, Andrew, because that goes to show that we're not always following the principles of low or high context. So I just saw a question there. They are different. Low context and high context cultures are different in the way they communicate. So that's the differentiation here. And there are certain regions or countries that are more linked or aligned with high versus low, to answer a question I just saw pop up in the chat. Yeah, and Dennis said it could definitely be put in those categories, definitely Western or non-Western. Again, that's why I list some of the regions there that are linked with this. It can appear like that, but really there are many regions that are linked with both high and low. I also saw a community member in the chat talk about how coming from the perspective of autism, I understand that as well. There might be some shared characteristics for those of us who are approaching this content from the perspective of a learning challenge. For example, if we're learner diverse or being autistic, etc., you might see some similarities. So to go back for a second, so a high context culture here would be there just be more of a reliance on nonverbal. So for example, if we were in a meeting, there would be a shared understanding, for example, of what your role would be. So you would automatically understand your role. You might nod to give understanding, but you don't necessarily need to speak up and say, I understand my task. Versus in a low context culture, in the same meeting, people would be actively speaking and probably directly saying, I've understood my role, I'll go and do this and get it back to you at this date. So it's more that in a high context culture, there's this shared understanding that happens very much at a nonverbal level. So a nod will suffice as a yes, but also behavior. So in high context culture, it's all about the group and the norms associated with that group. So people know what's expected of them a little bit more. Then in the low context, it's there's all kinds of possibilities because we're looking at it from a more individualistic perspective. So tell me, when you think about how your personal connection to one of these, whether you're from one of those regions or cultures, or you're looking at it you're looking at it from the perspective of learner diversity, etc. How do you think it influences your communication with team members or students or community members from different backgrounds? That's what I'm curious about now. And again, I appreciate that some of you are bringing in your own personal communication behaviors, whatever that is linked to. So how might your personal tendency or alignment with one of these contexts influence how you communicate with team members, students, or community members? Give that some thought. I'd love to hear from you in the chat. Hey, thank you, Natasha. So you automatically think that everyone has understood the expectations, and to build on what Mike just said, exactly, there might not be as clear-cut an understanding around expectations. Anyone else? Thinking about you now, your personal tendency, how you communicate, focusing on you, your relationship with high or low, how might it impact how you communicate with those from an educational, workplace, or community setting? So I see a lot around that expectation piece. Yeah, and if you're from a low context, you might be automatically a little bit more direct, because we rely on words and direct instruction to give tasks sometimes, and depending on your nonverbal, so how you deliver that direct message, it's certainly possible that someone from a different context culture that might be perceived differently. So it's just understanding, again, your personal tendency, because we all have embedded ways that we communicate, right? And we talked about this last week as well. Depending on our context, our backgrounds, our histories, our upbringing, our cultures, there are so many things that are embedded and have formed how we communicate. And some of that is just, it's been carried over into our behaviors, and we just need to do some reflection to think about how it might be interpreted or perceived by someone from a different cultural background or high or low context, just like you're all really thinking about in the chat. So it's just looking at not whether or not it's right or wrong, but thinking about how can it be perceived. And someone just in the chat talked about context, and I do think context definitely matters. So context and environment will also shape how you communicate. So let's move to the second theory, which is individualism and collectivism. And you'll see that there are pairings with high and low. So you're going to see that theme, the similarities again. So in an individualistic culture, there's an emphasis on you as the individual or personal responsibility. There's freedom of choice. You get a lot of autonomy. It's about achieving your goals and self-fulfillment. So there's a little bit more focus on you as an individual versus the group's goal. So Social behavior is often guided by personal goal or personal achievements, and individualistic cultures stress that the values are really going to benefit the individual. So it's just a little bit more of a focus on you as a person versus the group that you might belong to, whether that's your community or your culture. There's more of a focus on an individual. And people are often taught to be creative, self reliant. There's diverse populations. People have different jobs, specialized roles, and it's really dependent on the individual. And people are often valued for their distinct talents and perspectives. If we look at the collectivist perspective, so members of a collectivist culture or community, it's about the group. It's about the group that they belong to, whether that's their region or community or their culture. And it's all about how the group functions and establishing group harmony and working with and for the group. So less of a focus. Group goals take precedent over individual goals. And this is characterized by, you'll see extended primary groups in the family. So for example, there might be, for example, it wouldn't just be a parent or direct family unit that contributes to the upbringing of a child. Neighbors might be involved in that. There could be community members that are actively involved in that. So in a collectivist culture or group, you'll see that focus on that extended community, and it's all about supporting that community or in group. And people see themselves as really connected to a group where responsibility is shared and supported. Everything is consistent with group beliefs and values. So you can probably link one of these with high or low, right? You'll see similar type of parallels. I'd like to give you a moment to look at the chart I have displayed here. When we look at each category that we commonly think about in society or at work, I'd like you to just view the differences for each category when it comes to individualism versus collectivism. Take a moment to look at the differences. Interesting, Brian. Yeah, so like again, we don't have to necessarily, we can look at this from our lived experience, and that's how often we look at a lot of information and new knowledge is from our lived experience. We're trying to make sense of this by thinking about our lived experience. So for some of you, as Brian just posted in the chat, you might be thinking of a small community that you grew up in, right? You might be thinking of a particular workplace even, because we know in workplaces, individualism is definitely supported, and it's less, you can also individually achieve your goals. Whereas in a collectivist community or workplace that focuses on collectivism or community, there's that group focus. So which do you identify with? Same question. Which do you identify with? And for those of you who might be thinking there's parallels between high versus low, you're absolutely right. So do you identify with one of these more than another based on your lived experience? Let me know in the chat. Combination, deeply collectivist. Yep. Thank you. What about everyone else? A bit of both, okay, primarily. And again, as someone pointed out in the earlier chat, context can matter, and we can learn elements of all of these to bring in to our communication and base it on the situation and the audience. So that is essentially effective communication when we think about it, isn't it? We tailor or customize our communication to our audience and based on their needs, their backgrounds, their lived experience. We know that the more we account for that and make room for that and customize our message, the more we're going to be able to reach that person, the more we're going to be able to get our message across the way we intend it, the more we're going to learn about them. And if we can change and customize, the more we're in tune to who we're actually communicating with, the better our communication is going to be and the more success we're going to have with efforts around collaboration or partnering or just simply getting our ideas across when we support each other where we're all coming from, each other's lived experience. So for some of you, I just noticed something in the chat. Some of you found the collectivist really interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm really moved by collectivists as well. And it's so rewarding when I see communities or small groups of people that are really bonded together and they work together as a whole versus that individual focus. So let's think about for a moment the impact this actually has on communication, because there's going to be an impact. When we're looking at high and low cultures alone, right? We know that high context culture is very much dependent on nonverbal codes versus low, which is more on words. So how will that impact communication? So I've listed one. Eye contact is probably the biggest, right? So we will see in Western cultures, eye contact is associated often with the business world, with being confident, with knowing yourself, right? But that's not always how eye contact is seen or perceived in other cultures. Sometimes that's actually perceived as intrusive. What about hierarchy? Again, in a high context culture, hierarchy or levels or roles of authority, you respond and behave much differently to someone in an authoritative role than you would to someone who you're working next to. So, and eye contact is a big part of that. Eye contact is probably the biggest different piece in nonverbal communication across cultures, communities, and regions. Gestures. Let's look at gestures for a second. You know, pointing. So when we point, you know, your directions are over there. Other cultures might consider that rude. And smiling. I like to think that smiling is kind of, it's a ubiquitous, it spawns across all cultures, but you don't know always for sure, right? Some cultures might even think that that's trying to conceal another emotion, and research will show this. So it's really important to think about these elements because we are always communicating with our embedded ways of communicating, right? We're communicating based on our region, our upbringing, our history, our culture, and we may not always be thinking how it's being perceived by someone from a different upbringing, region, or culture. And high context, look at silence there, right? Look at the differences in silence. And that's something I've personally learned a lot about, how important silence is and about how many different communities really value that. Time. This is a big one too. There are cultural differences in how people approach work deadlines. And it's just, there's a difference there. So some people are more monochronic, like they're linear, and that definitely comes from, like, I link that to my background. You know, you're there 5 minutes before, but from some other cultures, it might be more relaxed, or it's just, it's not the same. There's not that adherence to maybe coming at that exact precise time. So this is just some. What are some other ways? What are some other aspects of communication that is shaped by high-low context differences or individual versus collectivism? So I've listed a few. What are some other elements of communication? Physical proximity. Thank you, Joe. Yeah, definitely. So space. So most of us are probably thinking nonverbal, and that's definitely where you should be thinking, because it really does depend. Excellent. Yeah, Brian, totally. You know, look, if we are really comfortable and we understand our audience, we realize this, right? And we're working with it. But a lot of us don't. A lot of us are not aware of these pieces, right? So when I first started in this work and this research, I was not as aware as I wish I had been for the people I was interacting with. It was really important to me to gain this information. So if you already know this, I celebrate you. And then we can teach it to others. But some of us are not always aware. Tone of voice, absolutely. And I would say speed as well. So how fast we talk and tone of voice. Other elements that might be impacted by high-low individual collectivists. Yeah, pop culture references. I'm gonna say things like slang and certain sayings. Yeah, offering, a greeting, definitely. Greetings are impacted. So how are we gonna get better? Some of this I touched on earlier, right? That importance of research and taking on that responsibility yourself, right? So if you are working with members from, say, for example, you identify with an individualistic approach because of your upbringing, background, region, culture, etc., you may be working though with people who identify more with a collectivist approach, or you may be from a low context and working with people from a high context, or it could be the opposite. So we're going to need to learn, right? And this is what we're here for, together, learning. And I've learned a lot already. I wish I could comment more with the chat because I'm seeing so many fascinating points. So this is how we do it. We come to webinars like this. We do our own research. Later, I'm going to give you those two theories, the author, so you can do more research yourself. And I strongly recommend trying to tailor your approach. I understand that we're all extremely busy in the workplace and we all have multiple demands. We have to understand, though, that people from different cultures, again, or regions or backgrounds, they may prefer a different way of communicating. Take, for example, instructions again, right? They may just resonate more with formal instructions. Again, think of high context where there's less focus on spoken word, right? So perhaps if you are collaborating with someone from a high context, it might be beneficial for you to use various ways to communicate your instructions. And neutral body language is what I recommend, and a technique called mirroring, which some of you may have heard of, which is very observing in a mindful way the person you're interacting with. So when we are mindfully communicating, we are very focused on the other person in a genuine way. So we're actually observing things like facial expressions, we're observing gestures, we're observing how they make eye contact. And instead of just making snap judgments about that, because sometimes we do that, instead, we again remain open-minded and realizing that it's probably different based on background or culture, etc. So then we might try mirroring. So for example, if you're using lots of gestures as you communicate and the person you're interacting with tends to be a little bit more just kind of sitting a little bit more calmly and their gestures are more closed in, you would mirror that. And that automatically makes the other person feel more comfortable. And of course, the more you get to know the person, the easier your exchanges will become. I also recommend using language tools or trying to at least understand interpretation of certain things in language. That's always an excellent thing to apply in your communication, especially written communication. Just make sure that things are translating is my main point. And we want to avoid expressions or slang, like hit the ground running, for example. I'm from Newfoundland and Labrador. We have a lot of jargon or sayings that's very much linked to our region. It doesn't always translate. So speaking in very clean, concise terms, and always checking for understanding, instead of what did you think about this, right? It's saying that in a way that comes off like this, I want to know what you thought about this. Do you have any thoughts about this? And doing it while you use the nonverbal, right? So we can ask really bluntly, or we can incorporate some nonverbal communication, or we can also use open questions to figure out, to check understanding. So we can inquire, I want to make sure that we've understood each other. So I just want to follow up on my last email, etc. So these are really good principles in communication anyway, and they definitely help when collaborating with people who identify with different backgrounds or individualism versus collectivism. And I'd like to know how you would now respond. I've got a quick scenario to end our day. And it's a really very simple scenario, but it gets you thinking about how you would respond. So you're working with a colleague from a high context culture on a project. They provide you with minimal verbal feedback during meetings. And this makes it hard for you to gauge, are they agreeing? Do they actually understand what you're asking for when it comes to the project? Because they've given you minimal verbal feedback, you're not quite sure if they've understood the goal of the project or the task. So that's the scenario. Give that some thought. And then I'd like to know, how would you approach this? And what would you suggest doing in this situation to ensure effective cross-cultural communication? Love to see your responses in the chat. So you're in a meeting about a big project. The person collaborating is from high context. They've given minimal indication that they've understood the project goals. How would you follow up for this? So ask for clarity, check for understanding. Great. Meet with them alone. That's an interesting point, Kim. Like maybe just sort of we need to look at the context and what's going on around that meeting in the project. Maybe it is beneficial to meet with them one-on-one, following up. So yeah, checking for understanding, following up. We might outline the feedback as well in a different format, right? So giving various formats of the instruction or directions. So there's a verbal, then there's a follow-up in a written form, and then the third way is we might check in with them one-on-one. Someone in the community mentioned universal design. I really support universal design practices, and I'm going to list that in the chat after when we end as something else that you can research, because it is a really great approach to not just designing information, but communication. Any other responses to our scenario to get us thinking about what we might do in that situation? So we know we're going to check for understanding. Yeah, we're going to try different ways, right? And we have to make this effort. And I do understand that everyone is very busy, but we're not always going to be guaranteed to be understood, especially if there is a different perception in the workplace based on someone's background, situation, culture, etc. So when we make that extra effort, if we sense that the person may not have understood us, how do we sense that? We are always mindfully observing, we're in tune with our audience, right? Then we make that extra effort to connect with them. What do we get for doing this? In the short term, it might cost you some more time, but in the long term, you're going to save on misunderstanding. You're going to promote inclusivity in your team, and you're going to connect with the person. And when people feel valued, they feel more motivated and the benefits keep going. So it's worth that extra effort to try adding in some different approaches if you feel you're not connecting with your audience member because of their situation, background, culture, etc. Yeah, some excellent tips in the chat, by the way, some excellent strategies from the community, right? Like I really encourage everybody to look at what's coming up in the chat. I'm seeing some amazing insights and strategies that are very applicable. All right, so it's the close of the presentation. I'm going to welcome back Allison, and we'll have some questions if there are any, and then we'll close for today.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jennifer. That was a really great presentation. And I think it certainly shows us that one way isn't better than the other, but that it's, if we are considering both sides, that we can, increase the value of our communication. And I think that based on the presentation you provided today, there's certainly ways to incorporate what we've learned. I do want to start with one question, which is um, that how, if you have any suggestions on how to manage written communication for people who are communicating with members of high and low context cultures, especially, and it could also be, with when we talk about kind of the collectivism and the individualism, but in one email, for example, that you may have all of those people on one email thread. Do you have any suggestions on how to best communicate?
Yeah, so if I've understood the question correctly, there might be members of a high context and a low context on the email thread.
Yes.
Okay, right. Okay. So that's a great question. And I would say that this is going to come up in any interpersonal exchange as well, right? Because we know now just from looking at the community here today that everybody is coming from a different perspective and perhaps and a different culture, etc. So we're always going to have mixed groups. So in that sense, we'd make a little bit of room for both. And I would say that follow-up after the email is really important. But just looking at writing the email or written communication, so we know in a high context culture that members of this culture, they look for meaning derived from the context, prior knowledge, and relationship. So they're less reliant on anything that's in the written word, right? So what we might do there is make sure that we do definitely have a verbal follow up, because members from a high context culture may not be as willing to really think that that written communication in an email is like a top priority versus when you come in to speak with them, and then there's that focus on the relationship they have with you and the communication like that. In a low context culture, of course, it's the opposite. There is more of a preference for direct, clear wording. But here's the thing, a lot of times we don't make our messages clear. So in a low context, we want to make our messages really structured and clear. Like, I always recommend using headings in email. So if you are describing a lot of things, break up that written content using headings. So you might use steps. So step 1 in this project, or if you're talking about deadlines, you'd have a heading in bold, deadline. So you're really structuring the information or categorizing it, making it super explicit, which is what members from a low context culture tend to look for. In terms of adapting for both, all communication is challenging. So you just need to be mindful, always reread what you've written, make sure you've included elements of both. And I can't stress enough about closing the loop, which is checking for understanding, following up to make sure that there was understanding. The more you're aware of your audience and the elements they bring from their background, perspective, or culture, the better prepared you will be to do your closing the loop and following up. And always, relationships are always valued. So doing your best to customize. If you can't, you're never going to get everything perfect, right? So that's why that follow up and checking for understanding is so vital.
And I do think it's interesting how you talked about the priority that gets put on an email, for example. I know that I see an email and I want to respond to it right away. Um, and other people will not prioritize that. So
Yeah.
it's interesting. And of course, when I want to respond right away, it turns into a bit of a, you can get a bit overwhelming when you have a lot of emails that are coming in if you feel that you're not getting to it. However, depending on who you're communicating with, that email might not be a priority. So that's maybe
Exactly.
something that I'll have to think about as a takeaway.
Exactly. Time, you wouldn't, the different meanings we place on time is fascinating.
Oh, absolutely. How can understanding high context and low context cultures improve workplace communication? And what are some of the practical steps that we can take to bridge that? I know you've talked about it, but it'd be great if you could kind of give us, kind of a one of those closing sentences just as a reminder.
Yeah, so I'm actually writing down the questions. Is I've noticed it just helps me focus a little bit more. So I just want to finish typing that. So, I mean, I always say that it's might be a lot of work in the short term, or it feels like, oh, I've got to do this extra effort. I've got multiple groups. I got to tailor different things. But you're going to minimize understandings. And when we minimize understandings, we actually save time long term. That's what I always encourage. Like, we're going to save time long term. A lot of things are really hard in the beginning. Any new communication, any new understanding, any new adjustment is always going to be hard. There's going to be a time frame where you're building out the processes and you're making the effort and you're trying to understand. And once that's established, though, you'll have enhanced collaboration. You'll be saving time long term, which is incredibly important to improving workplace efficiency, but also just getting along. Life is hard enough, and workplaces and education settings, things are hard. So the more that we're connecting with people authentically, the more those relationships support not only us personally, but also us professionally in terms of getting things done in the workplace. So remember those key differences. So always keep the key differences between high and low. Keep those in mind. And again, before I finish, I'm going to list in the chat where you can find more information, some practical ways to take this understanding back into the workplace. My first one is to really pay attention to nonverbal. And when I say pay attention, I mean real focus, not just, looking and then kind of looking at your phone. I mean mindful attention, being really careful to absorb what you're seeing from the other person nonverbally and then adjusting if you need to, or asking questions to make sure you're not misinterpreting. I think some of us, we might see different body language cues from someone from a different background, culture, or region. And some of us get defensive or we make judgments and those biases come up and take over. Slow that down, take the deep breath, and actually look at what you're seeing and then build on that from there. In terms of high context, that's probably my best tip for high context, and focus that relationship in low context. Be structured. Make an effort in your writing and your communication to be clear and organized. So that's my best recommendation. So making that extra effort, it's going to save you long term. So to recap, for high context, pay attention to body language cues, build understanding by asking questions or mirroring what you see. For low context, be prepared to be really organized and clear in your communication, checking for understanding. By the way, this is a process. This is not a one-time thing. This is something you're going to be doing all the time. So there is no one shot fits all. It's something you're working on all the time.
One of the things as you were speaking, I have a team member who often says haste makes waste. And if I think that fits perfectly here, because really, if you're moving too quickly or you're not cognizant of these differences, then really it's just adding more work to you. So a little bit of that, intentional action up front, I think could certainly make a big difference. So, in the interest of time, I want to thank you, Jennifer, for being here with us today. I can tell again by the engagement in the chat that this is a topic that is resonating with people, and we're certainly very glad that people can be part of it. So, we certainly hope that everyone's going to come back next week. So, it's not 2 weeks out, it's next week for part 3, which is overcoming bias and building inclusive language. Before we go, I encourage you again to stay connected with Memorial's alumni engagement team and the Gardner Center. This is particularly special year as Memorial is celebrating its 100th anniversary. There's a full calendar of exciting celebrations and events. You can see the website listed there on the slide, and we hope that you'll join us in marking this milestone. So once again, thank you on behalf of Alumni Engagement for being here today and being part of the Memorial community. And Jennifer, I'll let you close out the event.
Yeah, so I am going to list a few extra resources for those of you who'd like to do some independent follow-up so you can learn more. Don't forget, I am doing a full course in this coming up in March, so you can always attend that if you'd like more information. But a lot of this I know you'll want to research on your own, so I'm going to provide some links. But I do want to also say that, of course, you can always connect with us at any time. We offer custom training in any topic that you might need some further knowledge gaps minimized, or you just want more skill. You can see the incredible team members that deal with each aspect of Gardner Center services. So you can reach out to any of those. Feel free to take a screenshot of this. This is all on our website. Like I said, we've got my course coming up, Inclusive Communication, but we've got a wide range of topics that are well aligned with this. So here are some other examples of upcoming courses to build on your understanding from today. And before we close, I am going to list in the chat those resources for you because I want to make sure you are set up to research more. So give me 1 second. Just gonna put that in here now. So high and low is Edward T. Hall. And again, these have been updated over time, but this is still considered one of the leading theories in cross-cultural communication. And for nonverbal, I strongly recommend that you research the group you are connecting with. And I also recommend Positive Psychology is an amazing site. I'm typing quickly because I'm cognizant of time, but positivepsychology.com gives an incredible amount of resources about learning about each other non-verbally. So there's some takeaways for you. It's been my pleasure to be with you again. I wish I could have had more time as usual to read the insights. You had so much to offer me in the community. Thank you. Thank you for adding on to my knowledge, and hopefully we'll see you next week.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.